Most people believe influence is about being liked. It's not. It never was. Machiavelli understood something Carnegie sanitized for the masses. The man who is loved without being feared is only loved until it becomes inconvenient. And inconvenience is the currency of betrayal. You've been taught to smile, to listen, to compliment, to make others feel important. All true, all necessary, but incomplete because those tactics only work when the other person believes they chose to trust you, not that you engineered their trust like an architect engineers a foundation. Here's what they don't tell you in the seminars, the workshops, the books with soft covers. Friendship is theater, influence is architecture. The man who confuses the two spends his life wondering why loyalty evaporates the moment he stops performing. Machiavelli didn't write about friendship. He wrote about alliance. He wrote about necessity. He wrote about making yourself so valuable to another's survival that removing you would feel like cutting off their own hand. This is the difference between being liked and being indispensable. There's a pattern the great manipulators use. 3 invisible steps. Most never see all 3. By the end of this, you will. But first, you need to understand why the version of influence you've been practicing has been leaving you exposed to people who've already mastered what you're about to learn. Machiavelli observed that men judge more by their eyes than by their hands. Translation? People believe what they see about themselves reflected in you more than they believe what you actually say. The amateur compliments, the professional mirrors. Here's the mechanism. When you compliment someone, you give them a gift. Gifts create gratitude. Gratitude is shallow. It evaporates under pressure. But when you mirror someone's self-image back to them, their intelligence, their taste, their values, you do something far more insidious. You make them feel seen in a way that confirms what they already suspected about themselves, but feared no one else noticed. This isn't flattery. Flattery is obvious. Flattery triggers suspicion. Mirroring is surgical. You listen for what someone desperately wants to be true about themselves. Then you reflect that truth back using their language, their metaphors, their emotional tone, as if you independently arrived at the same conclusion about their character. Example, a colleague says, "I just think people don't appreciate nuance anymore." The amateur responds, "You're so right." The professional responds, "It's rare to meet someone who still thinks in layers instead of headlines." Most people mistake simplicity for clarity and wonder why they keep missing what's actually happening. Notice the difference? The first agrees. The second confirms their internal narrative. Machiavelli called this entering through their door. You don't force your way into someone's psychology. You knock using the exact rhythm they've been listening for their entire life. You're not just winning friends, you're creating emotional debt. Every time someone feels truly understood by you, they unconsciously bind a piece of their identity to your perception of them. And once someone's self-image depends on your validation, they will defend you to defend themselves. This is why the most influential people aren't the loudest. They're the ones who make others feel like the best version of themselves. But here's the trap most fall into. You've been taught reciprocity wrong. Dale Carnegie told you to give freely, to offer value without expectation, to be genuinely interested in others, all true, but incomplete. Because reciprocity isn't about what you give. It's about what the other person believes they owe, and the master of influence engineers the debt without the debtor ever realizing the ledger exists. Machiavelli understood this with ruthless clarity. He wrote, "Men are more ready to repay an injury than a benefit, because gratitude is a burden and revenge a pleasure." Read that again. Gratitude is a burden. People hate feeling indebted. They hate the weight of unpaid kindness. So the amateur loads people with favors, thinking generosity creates loyalty, then wonders why people avoid them, why invitations go unanswered, why distance grows instead of closeness. The professional does something different. They don't give, they enable. Here's the shift. Instead of doing something for someone, you create conditions where they succeed because of proximity to you. Then you let them take full credit, which paradoxically makes them more loyal than if you demanded recognition. Machiavelli knew this. The prince who lets his generals claim victory keeps his generals. The prince who steals glory creates conspirators. Example, your colleague is struggling with a presentation. The amateur offers to help, fixes the slides, then expects gratitude. The professional says, "You know what would make this sharper? If you frame the second section around their pain point instead of your solution, they'll lean in instead of defending." You'd own the room. Notice the structure? You gave them the insight. They execute it. They succeed. They feel smart. But unconsciously, they know you saw what they missed. And next time they face a problem, they'll seek your lens before they trust their own, which is the quiet transfer of authority that happens when you make someone better without making them feel small. Here's what's happening beneath the surface. Every time you enable someone's success without demanding credit, you make a deposit into an invisible ledger that only they can see. And unlike gratitude, which demands repayment and creates resentment, this ledger creates identity alignment. They don't owe you. They become aligned with you because you're not a creditor. You're a mirror that shows them their best self, and people will burn bridges to protect the person who holds that mirror, because losing you means losing the version of themselves they like most. But this only works if you avoid the third mistake most people make. You've been told to be confident, to project strength, to never show weakness. Machiavelli would call that suicide. Not because strength is wrong, but because unbroken strength triggers envy, suspicion, and the silent hope that you'll eventually fall, so others can feel elevated by your collapse. The strategist understands something the insecure never learn. Controlled vulnerability is the most powerful tool in human influence, because it transforms you from a threat into a confessor, and once someone believes they know your secrets, they'll protect you to protect the intimacy they think they've earned. Here's the architecture. You reveal a flaw, not a real one, not something that actually threatens your position. You reveal a curated weakness, something human, relatable, but ultimately irrelevant to your actual power structure. And you reveal it in a way that makes the other person feel chosen. Machiavelli wrote, "A prince must be a great pretender and dissembler." But he didn't mean lie, he meant curate. You show people the version of your vulnerability that makes them feel trusted without giving them leverage. And the difference between the two is the difference between intimacy and exploitation. Example, you're negotiating with a client. The amateur acts bulletproof. The client feels like they're being sold, which activates resistance. The professional says, "Can I be honest? I almost didn't pitch this. I wasn't sure you'd see the value the way I do. But the more I thought about what you're building, the more I realized this might be the only chance I get to work on something that actually matters instead of just being clever." Notice the layers. You revealed doubt. You revealed fear of rejection. You revealed that they matter to you, which flips the power dynamic without surrendering actual power, because you've made them feel like they're evaluating something precious instead of being sold something disposable. Here's the trap. Most people think vulnerability is about honesty. It's not. It's about perceived honesty. The person who confesses real weakness gets exploited. The person who confesses strategic weakness gets trust. Machiavelli understood that the prince who appears human is loved, but the prince who actually is human is destroyed, because humanity is weakness, and weakness in a leader is an invitation for replacement. So you curate. You show them the scar, not the wound. You show them the fear you've already overcome, not the fear you're currently navigating. You make them feel like they've seen behind the curtain, but the real machinery is 3 rooms deeper, and they'll never know it exists because they've already convinced themselves they've seen everything. You've been taught to fill silence, to keep conversation flowing, to avoid awkwardness. Machiavelli would call that cowardice disguised as politeness, because silence is where truth lives. And the person who controls silence controls confession, and confession is the raw material of influence. Here's what most miss. People don't reveal themselves when you ask questions. They reveal themselves when you stop talking after they think they have answered, because the human brain abhors conversational vacuums. And when you refuse to fill the silence, they will fill it with truth they didn't plan to give. Machiavelli wrote, "Everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are." Translation, stop appearing, start experiencing. Let them talk until the performance cracks. Example, someone says, "I'm fine with how the project turned out." The amateur moves on. The professional says nothing, just waits. 3 seconds, 5 seconds. The other person, unable to tolerate the gap, adds, "I mean, it's not exactly what I hoped for, but there it is, the truth beneath the script." And now you know what they actually think, what they actually fear, what they actually want. And you didn't interrogate them. You just refused to let them hide behind their first answer. Here's the psychology. When you create silence after someone speaks, their brain interprets it as judgment. And because humans are wired to resolve perceived judgment, they'll keep talking to fill the gap, to explain, to justify, to prove they're not what your silence might imply. This is how interrogators break suspects. This is how therapists surface repression. This is how Machiavelli's most effective princes learned what their advisors were really thinking, not by asking, but by waiting until the performance became too exhausting to maintain. And once someone has confessed to you, once they've said the thing they didn't plan to say, they bond to you, not because you judge them, but because you didn't. And the relief of unjudged confession is the most addictive drug in human psychology. But here's where it gets dangerous. You've been told loyalty is earned through consistency, through reliability, through being there when others need you. Machiavelli would say that's how you become useful, not how you become irreplaceable. And useful people get discarded the moment a better tool appears. The strategist understands. Loyalty isn't built through service. It's built through shared transgression. Here's the mechanism most never see. When you and another person share a secret, especially a secret that would damage one or both of you if exposed, you create a bond stronger than any favor, any kindness, any history. You create mutually assured destruction. You create alliance through vulnerability. Machiavelli observed this in every successful political partnership. The bonds that lasted weren't built on shared values, they were built on shared risk, and the moment two people know they'll fall together, they stop plotting against each other and start plotting together. But how do you engineer this without actual risk? You create perceived transgression. Example, you're working with a colleague on a difficult project. The amateur complains about leadership, hoping to bond through shared grievance. The professional says something different. "Can I tell you something I probably shouldn't? I think leadership already knows this project is doomed. I think they're testing to see who takes the fall and who finds a way out. I'm not planning to be the former." Notice the structure? You revealed a tactical read. You framed the situation as a trap. You implied insider knowledge. And now the other person feels like they've been led into a conspiracy, not a real one, but a perceptual one. And perception is the only reality that matters in human psychology. They'll remember you told them first. They'll remember you trusted them. And when the project inevitably struggles, they won't blame you. They'll feel like you warned them, which transforms you from a collaborator into a prophet. Here's what happens next. Once someone believes they share a secret with you, once they believe you've both seen behind the same curtain, they shift from evaluating you as an individual to evaluating you as part of an alliance. And alliances operate on different rules. Individuals can be replaced. Alliances require betrayal to break. Machiavelli wrote, "Men ought either to be indulged or utterly destroyed, because they take revenge for slight wrongs, but cannot do so for grave ones." Translation? Small bonds create small loyalty. Shared transgression creates unbreakable loyalty, because breaking it would require the other person to admit they were complicit, and most people would rather stay loyal than face that confession. But there's one final layer most never reach. You've been taught to burn bridges carefully, to leave on good terms, to never make enemies. Machiavelli would call that naive, because the way you leave determines whether you're remembered as a loss or as a lesson. And only one of those keeps you in power after you're gone. Here's the truth they don't teach. The most influential people aren't the ones who stay. They're the ones who leave at exactly the right moment. When their value is clear, their absence will be felt. But before they become so embedded that leaving looks like abandonment. Machiavelli understood this. He wrote about the prince who consolidates power, then delegates before resentment builds. The general who wins the battle, then steps aside before the soldiers start wondering why they need him during peace. The advisor who solves the crisis, then withdraws before the king feels overshadowed. Timing, not loyalty. Timing determines legacy. Example, you've been leading a successful project. The amateur rides it until it's done, then moves on. The professional exits at 80%, right when success is inevitable but not yet complete, and does it with a public endorsement of the successor. Why? Because when the project succeeds, you get credit for the foundation. When problems emerge, the successor gets blamed for the execution. You're remembered for the peak, not the plateau. And the moment people realize they miss what you brought, they'll pull you back with more power than you left with. Here's the psychology. When you remove yourself while still valuable, you create scarcity. Scarcity increases perceived value. Perceived value increases desire for your return. And the person who returns after being missed returns with leverage, with mystique, with the unspoken proof that things were better when they were present. Machiavelli called this the art of strategic withdrawal. You don't retreat because you're losing. You withdraw because you're winning, and you want them to realize it without you having to say it. But this only works if you've built the foundation correctly. Here's what most people miss. These aren't 6 separate tactics. They're 6 layers of the same architecture. Machiavelli never wrote about manipulation. He wrote about systems. Systems where every action reinforces the next, where every interaction deepens dependency, where the subject believes they're choosing freely, while the structure makes every other choice irrational. Let's walk through how a master uses all 6 layers in a single relationship. You meet someone, you listen, you mirror their self-image, you reflect their values, their intelligence, their taste, not through agreement, but through independent observation that confirms what they already believe about themselves. They feel seen, not flattered. Seen. You've entered through their door. You stop complimenting. You start enabling. You give them insights that make them succeed. You let them take credit. They start seeking your perspective before making decisions. Not because you demanded it, but because your lens has become more reliable than their own. You've created dependency without debt. You reveal a curated vulnerability, something human, something that makes them feel chosen. They don't realize the vulnerability is strategic. They just feel trusted, which transforms the relationship from transactional to intimate. You've moved from advisor to confidant. You stop filling gaps. You let them talk until the performance cracks. You learn what they're really afraid of, what they really want, what they really believe, and you never weaponize it against them, which makes them trust you more than anyone who's never held their secrets. You've become the person they can't lie to. You create a shared transgression, a mutual observation, a tactical read that implies insider knowledge. They believe they're in the inner circle, not because you said so, but because you showed them something others don't see. You've transformed the relationship into an alliance. You withdraw at the peak, not permanently, just strategically. You create scarcity. They realize what they had, and when they pull you back, you return with more leverage than you left with. Because absence is the only proof of value that doesn't require self-promotion. You've completed the architecture. But here's what Machiavelli never sugarcoated. This works. It works devastatingly well, but it requires something most people aren't willing to pay. You can never stop performing. Because the moment the structure becomes visible, the moment they see the mirrors, the curated confessions, the engineered dependencies, the entire architecture collapses, and you don't just lose influence, you become the villain in their story of awakening. Machiavelli wrote, "It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both." But he also wrote, "The lion cannot protect himself from traps, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. One must therefore be a fox to recognize traps, and a lion to frighten wolves." Translation? You must be both. Always. And the exhaustion of that duality is the price of power. So here's the question this entire mechanism asks. Are you willing to be the architect? Are you willing to see people as systems instead of souls? Are you willing to engineer trust, manufacture intimacy, and choreograph loyalty, knowing that the moment you stop, the moment you slip, the moment the mask falls, you'll lose everything you built faster than you built it? Most people say no. Not because they're moral, because they're afraid. Afraid of the isolation that comes from seeing the game while everyone else thinks it's real. Afraid of the exhaustion of maintaining the performance. Afraid of becoming the person Machiavelli described: effective, powerful, influential, and utterly alone in the understanding of why. But here's what separates the strategist from the subject. The strategist knows the game exists. The subject thinks the game is life. And once you've seen the architecture, once you understand the mirrors, the silence, the confessions, the conspiracies, the exits, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to believing friendship is accidental. You can't go back to believing influence is about being nice. You can't go back to the comfortable ignorance of thinking people act on truth instead of perception. Machiavelli didn't write The Prince to make people powerful. He wrote it to show them they were already being influenced by people who understood these mechanisms. And the only choice was whether to remain the subject or become the strategist. Here's what most people do after learning this. They try it once. It works. They feel disgusted. They retreat. They tell themselves they're too moral, too authentic, too good to play the game. And then they spend the rest of their lives wondering why less talented, less ethical, less intelligent people keep rising above them. The answer is simple. Those people aren't better. They're just less conflicted. They saw the architecture and decided the cost of not using it was higher than the cost of becoming it. Machiavelli would say, that's not corruption, that's clarity. Because morality without power is philosophy, and philosophy without action is just noise. You now understand the 6-layer mechanism of influence. The mirror, reflect their self-image to create emotional resonance. The enabler, create success proximity without debt. The confessor, use strategic vulnerability to manufacture intimacy. The silence, weaponize listening to surface hidden truth. The conspiracy, build loyalty through shared transgression. The exit, control your absence to increase your value. These aren't tactics, they're architecture. And architecture doesn't care about your intentions. It cares about your precision. Build it correctly and people will defend you without knowing why. Build it incorrectly and they'll destroy you without hesitation. Machiavelli's final lesson was this: the end justifies the means, but only if the end is achieved, because failed ambition is just called crime. Translation: if you're going to play, win, because second place in the game of influence isn't silver, it's evidence. One last thing, while you were watching this, you were being influenced. The hook that kept you here? Engineered. The curiosity gaps that pulled you forward? Calculated. The vulnerability in the narration that made you feel like you were being trusted with forbidden knowledge? Strategic. You just experienced every layer of the mechanism. And the fact that you're still here means it worked, which raises the final question. Now that you see the architecture, now that you know exactly how you were kept watching, will you use it, or will you spend the rest of your life noticing when it's being used on you? Machiavelli knew the answer. He wrote it 500 years ago. Men are so simple and so subject to present necessities that he who seeks to deceive will always find someone who will allow himself to be deceived. The game hasn't changed, only the players. And now you're one of them, whether you want to be or not.